Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Blythe, and I'm the director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance here at the Watson Institute at Brown University. Before I introduce today's speaker and talk about a little bit about the topic to set us up, just some housekeeping. You all know this by now. If you are inside the Brown Zoom setup, please put your questions, comments, etc. into the Q&A. If for some reason you can't see the Q&A, the chat will do. If you're watching this on YouTube live, first of all, welcome. Please put any questions that you'd like us to ask in the Q&A part into the comments section of YouTube. We've got someone monitoring that. They will cut and paste that and post it to the chat, and we will proceed on that basis. So before I introduce our speaker, Manuela Moschella, today, just a little bit of setup for why I thought this was a good one to get us going for this semester. So here we go. Central banking. It's one of those things that's simultaneously kind of predicated upon communication while being totally opaque to most people. It relies upon signals being transmitted to an audience to make policy work, but it's never that clear who the audience really is. One of my favorite papers from recent years was on inflation targeting in New Zealand, where they've had it for over 40 years. And the paper concluded that New Zealand businesses were several thousand times more likely to share pet videos than inflation forecasts. Nonetheless, central bankers take their reputation and communication strategies very seriously. So what is it that they want to communicate so credibly? Well, that used to be easy. Forged in the great hardware modification of the 1980s, making central banks independent from their political masters was seen as the sine qua non of fighting inflation through the control of short-term interest rates. Inflation was the ever-present danger, and these institutions were the only way to stop it. Price stability became the only goal worth having. But then the world changed, and this is what Manuela is writing about in her new book. After the global financial crisis of 2008, deflation, falling prices rather than inflation, rising prices, became the economic problem to solve, especially in Europe. And to do so, these central bankers creatively reinterpreted their mandates, now making price instability via programs such as massive QE injections their new objective. This rather obviously ran against the reputational capital that they'd built up over the prior 30 years. Doing so stabilized the system, but it also brought about a new interdependence between financial markets and central banks. Where the goal used to be quite simple, take away the punch bowl just as the party was getting started, in the words of Fed Chair McChesney Martin from the 1950s. The job post-2008 was to, quote, keep filling the punch bowl so that asset prices and too big to fail banks don't crash, unquote. That's really going to hurt that reputation for price stability that you've built up over 30 years. So central banks reinterpreted their mandates, and they also began to take a much broader view of financial risk, incorporating such things as targeted lending programs, the greening of the financial sector. And then came COVID, ever greater financial support for asset prices, to the extent that asset holders made more money in the 2 pandemic years than they did in the prior decade. And then guess what? Inflation came back. Now, you would think that this would allow central banks to simply pivot back to the old script and forget that messy interregnum. But this is Manuela's main point. Reputations matter. They're sticky. Having disavowed inflation risk in deflation fighting, it's not so easy to pivot once again, go back, particularly when financial markets are now dependent upon those ultra low rates and super cheap credits. And it's not clear what they should do now either. The old inflation of the 1970s, a wage price spiral, can be tempered by rising rates. But if, for example, the cost of lumber for US housing starts has tripled because it all comes from one part of Canada, and as Canada warms like the rest of the planet, more beetles infest trees and the supply crashes, it's far from clear what central banks or rate increases can do in such a world. It's a bit of a mess. To sort this out, I am joined by Manuela Moschella. She's an associate professor in international political economy at the Scuola Normale, Superiore in Florence, and is one of the go-to experts on central banking. Welcome to the Rhodes Center, Manuela.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for having me today. Let me start by sharing the screen so that I'm sure that it's working. So I assume that it's working. Okay. So I assume it's working. If not, please let me know. As Mark was saying, central banking has been through a very long journey recently, and this is what has been on my head for quite some time to make sense of this incredible journey that we have recently seen in central banking. And before I start, I have to say that usually my husband says that I tend to speak too much. Of course, this claim has no empirical evidence at all, but should I talk too much, Mark, please give me a sign somewhere, somehow. So let me walk you through what's really in the book project I'm working on, and any comments and suggestions are extremely welcome. What I'm interested in is this big transformation in central banking that Mark has already nicely summarized. And let me just say one thing at the outset. I think that what's at stake here is more than the transformation in monetary policy, okay? But it's what's really underlying this question and about the journey in central banking is the change in the macroeconomic regime at large, okay? So really about the regime that has been formed since the late 1970s about how to ensure macroeconomic stability, okay? And it changes over time. And monetary policy since the 1970s and in particular the 1980s had really become the core pillar of how we should run domestic economies, okay? How we should achieve macroeconomic stabilization. And so the question is really, I mean, if we think about what has changed in monetary policy over the past decade or so, it's really a question about some bigger changes, about changes in macroeconomic regimes at large. So let me just to set the stage, what's the big change here? Okay, why am I saying that we are seeing really a big transformation that started around 2008 with the global financial crisis and then continue with COVID crisis? So let me start with the benchmark against which we can appreciate the change that has taken place in central banking. So basically, before 2008, for the past 3 decades, more and large, central banking has revolved around this cozy word, if you want, and it had a clear governance set up. Okay, so it was price stability, that is to say, maintaining low and stable inflation, became the primary objective of monetary policy. And interest rate policy became the technology, that is the instrument through which to achieve price stability. And interest rate policy is particularly important because by lowering and raising the interest rates, central banks can send an input, right, to the real economy. I will get back to that. But it's a general input, okay? It's not tailored to some sectors in the economy. So it was a generalized type of policy instrument. So the goal of price stability, the interest rate technology, and as I wrote in this slide, it was price stability plus interest rate technology that really made what an independent central bank is about. So this is really, in a nutshell, what has been the mantra, right, in policy and monetary circles for over 3 decades. And it has been, honestly, a successful governance setup because, you know, after the 1970s, volatility in inflation has basically disappeared. We had the period of the so-called Great Moderation. So when we had low inflation and good rate of growth, so everything was doing fine. And, you know, central bankers became kind of the king of macroeconomic stability. What happened with the 2008 crisis? And then even if you want, at the deepest level with the COVID crisis, the world significantly changed, okay? If from the 1970s, basically, to 2008, central banks have been basically obsessed with maintaining low and stable inflation, suddenly inflation just became too low, okay, because the recession, as soon as the asset bubble burst, we had a recessionary and a deflationary environment. So what happened on the side of central bank, and I'm interested in the side in terms of the public policies that were enacted. So I'm interested in central banks' policies. How do they reacted to this change context? There was a tremendous shift away from the cozy setup that I was telling you about before. And because what happened, central banks shifted from the so-called standard interest rate policy, the conventional rate policy, to the so-called unconventional policies. But what does it entail? What's behind this shift? So basically, when central banks undertake unconventional policies, they shift the objective, okay? So they do not longer just focus on price stability, but they have to prioritize other objectives, okay, like unemployment and financial stability. But this is what, as I was saying, is a significant shift away from the past 3 decades, because for the past 3 decades, what central banks have been saying, look, we just can't control, the price level. We have nothing to do about long-term growth, demand aggregates. These are, things that are outside the pursuit and the purview of central banks. It is probably for structural policies to pursue, but it's not an objective of central banks.
Sorry to interrupt for a moment.
Sure.
Your slides are not centered. Can you make sure that they are? Try and hit the full screen function. See if that makes a difference. Try it again.
Where is the full
no,
screen?
No, they're not. They're still off to the side. I'm not entirely sure how to fix that.
Let me try if I can try again. Okay, I will do like this and I will share again.
Try again.
Okay.
No, they're not. For some reason, they're cutting off one part of the slide. Perhaps it's best to do. Can you go back to the way it was?
Yes.
That is to say, not full screen.
Like this?
Yeah, that's at least people can see it that way. If you can scroll through it that way, you'll see the whole thing. No worries. That's great. Just so everyone can see.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely. So basically, as I was saying, as central banks shifted from conventional interest rate policy to unconventional monetary policies that entailed, buying assets, whether public or private, providing mass liquidity to the banking sector, they shifted the main objective and they shifted away from price stability. They even undermined the price stability objective, as Krugman already said in 1998 with reference to what was going on in Japan. And Japan is one of the few advanced economies that had experienced deflation after the 1970s. Krugman used to say that when central banks try to fight deflation and they turn unconventional, they happen to be irresponsible. What does it mean? That in opposition and contrary to the price stability objective, they try to create inflation, okay? So they commit to be irresponsible in the sense that they commit to increase the price level beyond, what would be considered reckless monetary policy in normal times. Okay, so the focus really of the objective of monetary policy significantly changed. And also in terms of instruments, in terms of the type of intervention that central banks made, there is a significant shift, because as I was saying, when central banks command the short-term interest rates, so basically what does it entail? It means that central banks can change the rate at which commercial banks can borrow from the central bank. And in doing so, they basically send a signal, right, to the economy, okay? And raising rates, they want to signal that the price of money is increasing. And so all the institutional lending, the borrowing, and the associated rates will go up together with the central bank signal. And the opposite happens when the lower rate. But so what does it mean? That the central banks is sending a generalized input to the economy, is steering the economy from distance, okay? So it does not get its hands involved in the economy. this changes completely with unconventional policies, because in contrast to this general hands-off approach, unconventional policies means that central banks take on credit risks. Okay, they take decisions about who should get the credit, which sectors, which households, which part of the financial sector should get the money and who should not. And in doing so, they also take the risk in case of non-repayment. And also by buying assets that are not just private, but also public, central banks basically brought down with another mantra that have been built over the past 3 decades, that is the mantra of monetary dominance. That is, an independent central bank should set its interest rate, its monetary policy independently from government's finances needs. What we have seen over the past decade or so is that central bank's policy has basically worked hand in hand with government's policies, and it has supported government's policies and finances to shield the economies from the worst effects of the recession. So this is a very huge transformation in monetary policy. It's not uncommon to read sentences like these, that is an historically unprecedented shift. And Claudio Borio is one of the most prominent economists at the Bank of the International Settlement, which is known also as the central bank's bank. So it gives you an idea, it's really the club of central banks. So it's not really uncommon to read about a statement like this that underlined really how unprecedented this transformation in monetary policy was. It is also a generalized change across basically all advanced economies. Okay, in my book, I focus mostly on advanced economies. This is not to say that there are no differences across countries. Of course, there are. And I'm going to say in a minute in the book, I focus on the ECB and the US Federal Reserve. And of course, these are very different countries, very different central banks. And there are important differences between the two central banks and how do they react to their external environment. But these cross-country differences do not really invalidate the basic observation here, right? That the transformation took place. So what is really amazing to me is that, I mean, there have been a lot of literature that have tried to explain differences across the two sides of the Atlantic, why the ECB lagged behind the US Fed and stuff like that. For me, what is really interesting is the commonality. So how come that really basically all central banks ultimately embraced this transformation? I think it's also, I wrote unthinkable, probably it's a little bit too much, but, for someone who has studied central banks, really what happened, it was almost unthinkable, because we used to think of central banks as these conservative agents, these technocrats that really care about price stability, and suddenly they became the agents of transformation, right? I mean, they realized that they had to adjust their policies and even challenge, the inflation reputation, the anti-inflation reputation that they have built. So why did we witness this transformation? And what can explain it? So how can we make sense of this big transformation in monetary policy that, I want to repeat, this goes beyond monetary policy, but it really tells us about the pillar of macroeconomic regime that has been dominant since the 1970s, 1980s. And there are at least two broad explanations out there. And of course, I'm simplifying, but please bear with me. On the one end, there is a structural explanation. There are those that says, look, there have been changes in economic conditions. As I was saying, the world's completely changed upside down. We switched from an environment in which inflation was the problem to an environment in which deflation became the problem. Pragmatic, independent policymakers, they simply reacted to new economic realities on the ground. And this is the type of logic that usually stands behind, arguments like central banks have become the only game in town. People like Elerian or even central banks have supported this narrative. They are the pragmatic policymakers that responded to changes on the ground. On the other end, there is the ideational explanation. And the ideational explanation posits that how central banks responded to the economic condition was filtered by new ideas, by a new narrative. And of course, this is an argument that has been made forcefully in the area, especially of central banking in Europe, by McNamara, when she tried to explain the creation of the European Monetary Union. So if we want to understand why important shifts in macroeconomic policy take place, we have to look at the narratives and the ideas. And of course, Mark as well has written extensively about that. And recently, in the case of central banks, we have had very important contributions that have tried to explain how central banks shifted in responses to the global financial crisis first and to the COVID crisis by processes of technocratic learning and technocratic battle. You might remember that especially after 2008, there were a huge discussion about how central banks had learned the lessons from the Great Depression, for instance. Okay, so there is a lot of discussion about technocratic learning. These two explanations are very different, but they have a point in common. And the point in common is that ultimately they both depict a process of change that was technocratic, that was driven by technocrats, where expertise and political installation independence were assets that were the key mechanisms through which central banks could adapt to new circumstances. The logic is different, but ultimately they both depict this world in which technocrats are basically free to change their policies once they settle onto new ideas, once they make up for informational problems, and so on. What I try to do in the book, and I borrow, of course, I'm not inventing anything here, but I borrow from a very long-standing tradition, is that policy always needs politics. Okay, so I'm really trying to go beyond these technocratic explanations to see, look, we had this change, but we cannot understand this change just looking at the expertise, at the technocracy of these central banks, but we also have to look at patterns of public salience and political support, how suddenly monetary policy became politicized, and who supported the shift, okay? Of course, it may sound, I understand, and even listening to myself, it may sound odd to talk about politics when we talk about independent central banks. But here, the point I'm trying to make that just as politicians, right, have to find support for the policies they want to implement, to adopt and implement, so it's the same for central banks. But the modality is the channel through which central banks build support is different than the one that policymakers use. And the key channel here for central banks is reputation, okay? So because central banks are public institutions, and there's a long tradition in public administrations, as compellingly shown, public institutions also act based on their reputation, on the public image that they build over time. And here, I mean, the work of Daniel Carpenter on, several US agencies is, of course, paramount, is probably the most widely defined definition of reputation. So reputation refers to a set of symbolic belief about the unique or severable capacities, roles, obligation of an organization, where these beliefs are embedded in audience networks. So it's really about the organizational image, about the agency goal, mission, capacity that has to be embedded in audience network. Okay, so this leads us to the question of audiences. So what are the implications of stressing the importance of reputation? Since organizations like central banks, public institutions invest in reputation, and this is the key probably takeaway from people like Carpenter's work, they invest in reputation. Reputation becomes an important source of power and an important source to legitimize independence. So really, reputation becomes an asset for public institutions. So it means that central banks, like other public institutions, they face reputational traps. Okay, so they get entrapped in the reputational image they have been built in the past. Okay, and this brings about policy timidness most of the time, because they tend to replicate existing scripts. Indeed, I mean, in the book, what I try to do is that, the shift, the break away from orthodoxy did not happen in one night. There were several mistakes and several policy mistakes or timid steps that were taken along the way, mostly because, central banks were building from their past reputation. So it was very difficult for central banks to go away from the image that they have carved for themselves as inflation fighters. So it was very difficult for them to do that. But there is another implication from reputation. As I was saying, reputation is intimately linked to the notion of audiences. There is no reputation if there is no audience that recognize what an institution is about. So one of the key insights in the literature on public organizations and administration is large is that when audiences react and when there are reputational threats for an organization, for a public institution, this is the moment where the policy shifts arrive. And this is exactly what I tried to chart in the book, and I'm going to tell you more in a second. But so basically what allowed central banks to break away from orthodoxy was that suddenly, the politics around them changed. And monetary policy became much more visible. They became an object of public contestation. Different groups mobilized. Governments also sometimes also pushed central banks in certain directions and not others. But so all these lead us to the questions of what audiences mattered, which audience and political support matter the most for the political shift to take place. And here, when we talk about central banks, we usually think, especially in political economy, international political economy, to financial markets as the major constituency that supports central bank policy. When we talk about the deflationary coalition that has been created since the 1990s, this is exactly the major insight that central banks and the rise of the objective of low and stable inflation has to do because there was a strong constituencies, the financial sector constituency, that supported those policies. What I try to say in the book is that with the shift to the deflationary politics, we had an important shift also in politics. And the public grievances became much more important in a crisis as we shifted from quiet politics to crisis politics. And so it became much more difficult for central banks also to ignore, the grievances from society at large. And also, probably importantly, in terms of coalitional politics, it is fair to say that in a deflationary environment, the importance of monetary easing becomes important to both ordinary citizens, but also to the financial sector as well, right? Because in a deflationary environment, monetary easing continued to serve the interests of the financial sector because it shore up asset prices. When the central bank buys assets, it supports asset prices. But at the same time, the same monetary easing became the instrument through which the central bank could satisfy a much broader societal demands for growth creation and demand. So this is what I'm going to try to argue. It's how reputation initially entrapped central bank. It made extremely difficult the shift away. But then, as politics around them changed and they gathered political support, the case for the shift became much more important. How do I do? How do I try to test this argument? I do an historical case comparison between the US Fed and the European Central Bank. Why I focus on them for several reasons, also for practical reasons. Over the past years, I've written extensively, mostly journal articles on these central banks. And so I could tap into my previous research, but also for an important, in terms of research design, this is important. as I was saying, usually the US Fed and the ECB are pitted against one each other. Because we usually say that the ECB was the laggard, it refused to break away with conventional policies. It was still obsessed with inflation politics when the world was going in another direction. And so really most of the analysis have been to tease out the differences in the reaction function of the two central banks. What I think is important, these differences exist, okay? The ECB was a laggard, but as I was saying since the very beginning, this cross-country variation really do not undermine, do not invalidate the major observation here, that they both ultimately moved away from what considered orthodoxy and the monetary regime for over 3 decades. So what I'm doing in my book project, I'm basically reconstructing the historical process that led to the formation of the reputation of central banks at large and of the two central banks that I analyze in particular. So my story basically starts with the 1970s and the great inflation, the stagflation, and the Volcker shock, and how central banks really came to build this reputation as conservative in terms of anti-inflation, inflation-averse institution, and politically neutral institution, so that they use interest rates in general terms without taking distributional decisions in the economy. In comparing the two cases, I show that there were cases of policy timidness in both central banks. Even what we consider the mighty, resolute Fed had cases at moments where it was more timid than the circumstances would have allowed. And of course, I trace this timidness to the reputational constraints. And for both central banks, I try to trace the way in which public salience, government support at large, basically created the conditions, facilitated the conditions for policy shifts. Let me give you some examples, which I think, at least for me, are telling to make this case about the conditions and the importance of the political conditions to bring about policy shifts. One is in the case of the US Fed, and is the shift from the Lehman debacle to the AIG support. Okay, so we are really at the height of the financial crisis. And you might remember that the Fed refused to intervene and extend credit and support when Lehman was about to fail. And at that time, there are many explanations, of course, for why this happened. But the Fed continued repeating that he had no the legal authority to intervene in the case of Lehman. There was this discussion that I tries to reconstruct in the book about really inside the Fed, they were really concerned about the hit that saving Lehman would have on the reputation of the Fed. But then, in just a couple of days, the situation completely changed. Of course, there was a huge market collapse. We cannot deny that. But the politics also changed. Okay, well, and if you ever read, the memoir of the main policymakers at the time, they all recall how congressional politics changed after Lehman. There is this famous line that everything needed to crash down for leading the Congress to act, right? So, there was also a huge political change, and in this huge political change, also the Fed became really the most unconventional, and it crossed basically all the red lines in what was before used to be considered monetary orthodoxy. The same goes for the ECB, and the famous Draghi whatever it takes speech in 2012, what I try to argue in the book that Draghi, of course, is important. The change at the helmet of the ECB was extremely important. But again, were it not for the political support that finally, even in Europe, built around the shift for the ECB to take place, probably Draghi would not have delivered the whatever it takes speech. So it really, I mean, it was that ultimately, you know, the German government, other governments basically signaled that they were on board, and they signal it also by providing support in terms of institutional support for the ECB to act. And this was even much more clear when the COVID crisis appeared, and you know, I trace how both central banks revised their monetary strategies, and they really tried to rebalance or to shift away from the price stability objective and to make it more symmetrical and to take into consideration more unemployment considerations. And it's again, I think that without taking into account really how the broader political conditions change, it's really important, almost very difficult to make sense of the transformation in central banking. So just to conclude, what's the main message that I'm trying to articulate? And again, as I was saying, I'm building from a very well-established tradition in political economies that politics drives inflation policy. Okay, so Kirchner is probably one of those that have made this argument much more clearly, but Mark has written on that as well. So, you know, inflation policy, whether it is inflation or anti-deflation policy, needs political support. But the point also trying to make is that when we talk about political support, we have to think about really the characteristics of central banks and the way politics make its way into independent central banks is not necessarily via lobbying of financial markets or ideology, but it works through a powerful informal channel that is reputation. Okay, so central banks care about the reputation, so they shift away from the past when they have the political support, when they are sure that they can retain the political support of their audiences. Some of the major objectives that I try to achieve with this book project are that I also aim to redress a little bit of a scholarship bias, which has followed real world events, in the sense that we have a lot of literature in both political science and economics that tell us about central bank independence and the fight to inflation. So when and how independent central banks are able to fight inflation. I think that we do not have really devoted significant attention to the same question about how central banks and the extent to which central banks are able to fight deflation. So I'm trying to rebalance and to refocus attention also on the ability of central banks to fight deflation as much as they are able to fight inflation. As I was saying, I think that the shift in monetary policy is a good case. I mean, we have always considered central banks as the pillars of the macroeconomic regime that has taken place, what is known with the shift, you know, from Keynesianism to monetarism. We have considered central banks really the core pillar of the monetarist system. And so reflecting on the evolution of monetary policy shed some light into this broader evolution on macroeconomic regimes. And last but not least, as also Mark was saying in his introduction, I think that probably we are confronting very difficult times. I mean, inflation is once again on the radar screen, probably more than the radar screen. And probably we are about to witness another major policy shifts. And so it's important to understand who supports those policy changes, what are the political groups, the societal alignments that support, again, monetary policy. And the same goes for the new mandates that central banks are likely to take. There is a huge discussion about whether central banks should be much more involved in greening finance and in supporting the shift to a green economy. And again, I think it's really important to have a clear idea of who can influence support for central banks in this shift. And I'll stop it here. Thank you.
That was great. I would hardly say that you talked too much, but you certainly covered an awful lot of ground, and we have 20 minutes left for questions. They're beginning to come in. So folks that have actually got their hands up who are in on Zoom, I can just ask you to unmute and ask your question if that's possible. I hope that's possible. Hayden, is that possible?
Yes.
Excellent. In which case, Samuel, please come off of mute and ask your question. Okay, we seem to be having a problem getting Samuel off of mute. Perhaps you can put it into the Q&A. Nicolo, you're up. You have a question in here. Can you ask your question live? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Manuela, for the great presentation. I really look forward to read more about it. So my question is, based on the ideas that one explanation for the increase in independent central banks could lie in the political party system, so the increase in the power that you described. Because central bank independence was established in a moment that was characterized by a strong ideological consensus over economic policy. So we had both parties from the center left and center right that agree that this was the right thing to do, alongside a number of other policies in economics. So today, my feeling is that designing economic policies is more difficult as the political system is more polarized, both in the US and the EU, and in particular in the EU, you see fringe parties that gain consensus at the expenses of mainstream parties. So in this context, it is more difficult in a polarized context to reach a political consensus. And my feeling is that this could be an explanation for why we need independent agencies like independent central banks to take over and then take this position also on a broader set of policies than their initial mandate, regardless of whether it's the right thing to do or not. So my question is, if this reasoning is viable, what ideological direction is the politicization of monetary policy taking, in your opinion? And depending on which ideological set the central bank acquires, how do you think this can affect the central bank reputation, intended, as you said, as a source of political legitimacy? Thank you.
So a nice, simple question to get us started.
Yes. Should I take it?
Yeah,
right
take
away?
it one at a time.
Yes.
That'd be great.
Okay, Nicola, this is a wonderful question, a very difficult question, and I do not have a straight answer, so I will try to reason aloud here with you. I completely agree with you that there is a significant difference between today's politics and, if we want, the 1980s, the 1990s, at least for the moment, right? I completely agree with you that probably at least on both sides of the Atlantic, politics is much more polarized, and it's very difficult to understand what would be the signal, right, to independent central banks. So I really don't know what kind of, if there will be an ideological type of imprint that will be passed on to central banks. But I think your point is an important consequence for the current fight to inflation, right? So that probably it can also explain also why central banks have been much more passive than in the past, right? So they have resisted basically up to now to the inflation spikes. It may also have to do because of this political polarization. What I probably do not entirely agree with you is when you say, I mean, since politics is polarized, that's the reason why we need independent central banks. I mean, democratic politics is democratic politics when it is polarized or when it is consensual. And so I don't think that, being the advantage of having an independent central banks should be linked to the polarization among political parties, because I mean, democratic politics is another realm, right? It could be polarized in certain moment. We can have populists at other moments. We can have consensual politics, but I would not agree that the more polarized, the better it is to be in the safe hands of a central bank. I don't know. I don't buy this argument because ultimately these are public institutions, and they respond to their political principles. They respond to the citizens, and politics can change and should change independently of what central banks do. But other than that, I really don't know how these partisan politics will play out, and whether we will have a repeat of what happened in the 1980s or in the 90s. Then I don't know, at a certain point, I mean, we will have an ideological convergence around a new idea of how we should run our economies or not. So I really, it's difficult to tell. I do not have any clear idea at this moment, but thank you.
And a fair and honest answer. We're going to try and get back to Samuel at this point. Samuel, can you unmute now?
All right, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. And thanks to the presenter. I'm also happy to see my blade. I use your work on austerity to teach here at Carleton University. My question is about the continued orthodoxy of neoliberal economics in developing countries, and how the IMF, for instance, continue to push for the independence of central bank against the developmental needs of these countries. How do you think that the state can ensure that central bank perform development function rather than market advancing functions like inflation targeting and things like that? I hope I'm clear.
Thank you very much, Samuel. A short answer would be that orthodoxies are hard to die. And, especially in developing countries, where the effect, especially of the global financial crisis, has been different, right? It's been more muted. I mean, one of the reasons why I focus on developed economies is that the global financial crisis was at the core, of advanced economies. The IMF and supporting, central bank independence in developing countries, we have some extraordinary contributions out there, people like Juliet Johnson and her book, and how she explained this continuous orthodoxy because of the networks, that the IMF has been able to build around the world with also local actors. The IMF and central banks, I started off, my scholarly career as a scholar of the IMF, and I've always been intrigued, and I see that the commonalities between the IMF and the central bank, and the reason why I'm interested in this institution is because they are both at the intersection between technocracy and politics. Because the IMF, similarly to what central banks are public institutions that are run by technocrats, but at the same time, they cannot really ignore what's going on in their membership. So probably, some of the dynamics of change that I try to itemize for what has happened with monetary policy for central banks in advanced economy may also apply for the IMF. But then, the IMF also deals with very different constituencies, the advanced economy, the developing countries. But so, to go back to your question, I think that, the IMF continues to, support central bank independence in developing countries because it has not been discredited in the same way that it has been done in the advanced economies with the recent crisis.
Great, thank you very much. Alexander, can you ask your question, please?
Now?
You're in.
There we go. Thank you so much for a great talk. I was wondering, the political support you're discussing, is it more about enabling central bankers to do something they wanted to do but felt constrained not to do before, or is it about pressuring them? They didn't want to do this, but then they feel like this support forces them to do it.
Thank you, Alexander. This is one of the theoretical questions I had in my mind. It's more the first. It's the way I reconstructed several episodes in the history of the ECB and the US Fed is that, at a certain point, they probably would have liked to act, but they did not do that because they felt that they did not have enough political support. So they only acted when they realized that there was political support. So I wouldn't say that political support pushed central banks to go where they did not want to go. Okay, so it was more an enabling condition for central banks to act. But the key driver was the change in politics, so that they realized that so I would distinguish between drivers and conditions. So if political support was more the condition, the driver was really the change in the broader politics around them.
So it's interesting you should say that. I'm just going to jump in for a second because Mark Beckman has a question and he can't actually ask it live. We've also got one from Stein Koerning that's very similar. So I'm just going to kind of read out bits from those questions and ask you to elaborate. So from Mark, do you think that certain actors are better able to cause reputational threats and that leads to policy shifts? I mean,
sorry, Mark, I missed the first part of the question.
Sorry, do you think that certain actors are better able to cause reputational threats than others and thereby cause policy shifts? Basically, do private financial market participants have more strength than politicians? Because this would matter for whose independence, whose reputation, etc. And Stein's question follows on from this, which you said in your presentation that you said that crisis politics led to a grievance from the public that was hard to ignore. That's pushing from the public out, the broader public. But then in your examples, you describe it as a shift in Congress and whatever it takes as a shift amongst EU heads of government. So again, this goes back to Alex's question, who's producing the politics? Who's pushing and who's pulling in all of this?
That's absolutely a key question that I haven't completely figured out in the theoretical setup I'm working on. My feeling is that, when we have a crisis, and as I was saying, I mean, the most important thing, so which audiences matter, because at the end of the day, I mean, for a reputational approach, it's really important to understand what are the audiences that matter, those that can really create the conditions for a policy shift. My feeling is that, and also it's based on what I found, that public pressure became relevant, that you find it in public officials, in central bankers' official speeches, in the minutes of the meetings, that they were concerned about the public turning against them. And if you think about what happened in Europe and in the United States, I mean, central banks devoted much more time in reaching out to the public, which is another tremendous transformation. They really try to make this important shift and communicate to the public. Then, of course, I mean, these public grievances, public discontent to central banks is also mediated by the elected governments. Okay, so I think that the governments, so the public mobilizes the governments. So that's the reason why I think in the empirical evidence I have, ultimately is when governments somehow provide explicit support and central banks then act. But they are linked. It's the public discontent that then mobilizes governments. So for me, they are linked, but it's absolutely crucial to understand, I mean, the audience question.
So we have time for one more coming in at this point, and this is again on point. I'd ask Mark Suchman to come in and ask his question round. Are you there, Mark? Yes, he is. Go ahead.
Hey, there we go. I wasn't trying to get my speakers to work. And so a fascinating talk, and and really great. And I'm just curious, the pattern that you describe is something that I think we can see with a lot of administrative and independent agencies in the United States, where kind of the logjam or the polarized stalemate in the legislative branch essentially creates situations where technocrats in administrative agencies or in independent agencies feel that that they must act, or at least that they have an excuse to act, in the absence of a democratic authorization. That they sort of creatively extend the mandate for the agency in order to do something. And I think we see this in the U.S. around immigration. We see it to some degree around climate. It's increasingly sort of a two-branch government where the administration acts and the courts sometimes permit it and sometimes don't, and Congress simply sits there and talks, and complains one way or the other, but doesn't do anything. And I think that in your story, one thing that's really highlights is that if that dynamic is going on, and some of the questions suggest that something analogous may be going on in Europe, that the moments of crisis become really important as kind of authorizing for that kind of technocratic intervention. And why can't we wait for a stronger democratic mandate? Well, because this is a crisis. And I'm wondering if that rings true to you, and how much you think that's true both in Europe and in the US, or how much that's a kind of distinctively US phenomenon.
Mark, thank you very much. It's a terrific question. And I have to say that in thinking about these reputational arguments, I've been extremely influenced by the literature on public administrations. And, you know, the US public agencies are the ones that are probably the most studied. And I found them extremely interesting. My argument is different from the one that you are trying to say, you're trying to depict, because you say that, you know, technocratic agencies ultimately step in when, you know, they do not get a political mandate. My argument is not exactly that. I mean that even if the governments do not provide a new full-fledged mandate, but they still have to signal that they are behind the technocratic agent, because otherwise the technocratic agent can intervene, but its interventions would be halfway. They will be timid and cautious. So my argument is that, yes, probably technocratic agencies like central banks could fill in the void, you know, until politics sort itself out. But then when they really have to break away from the past, they need to have political support, and in particular government support, because otherwise they do not want to put their reputational capital at stake, and they really struggle to shift away from past policies. So that's what I try to argue.
That's great. Thank you very much. We're right on time. That was a fabulous talk. Great questions for everyone. Great turnout. Very happy for the first Rhodes talk of the semester. We've got tons more coming up this semester. Some really, really interesting ones coming later in the year. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Manuela and I are going to take a break now, and then we're going to do the podcast for this. That will be up on our website and available everywhere in about 2 to 3 weeks' time. And then, of course, eventually her book will come out once the inflation part of the story is written into this. So we can all look forward to that as well. So thanks to everyone for coming today, and I hope to see you the next time. And thank you, Manuela.
Thank you.